That's what we were after when we went into Protestantism. We were looking for just get back to what I'm reading in the Bible, right? What I see in St. Paul, what I'm seeing. I just get back to that church.
And that's a good place to start. I mean, that's a good move.
But that's the move first for that was the Reformation. Like, let's get back to the Bible, really. So obviously, Dan, if we had an area of expertise at all, it would be patristics. That's what we studied. Studied Roman civilization in our undergrad, and then we did a master's program in patristics. And since then, even we've continued. It hasn't stopped. So people always ask whenever we get into a conversation with them, and they say, "Oh, you studied the early church. That's really strange." How will you ever make a career out of that? But
well, we're trying.
Like and subscribe. They inevitably ask, so what is it? Are they Catholic, or are they Protestant, or what are they? And
you never really get the question of, what's your takeaway from the fathers? I was talking to a seminarian actually just recently, a couple of weeks ago, and that was his question. So, what's the one takeaway that you can give me from the fathers?
Yeah. So, what would you say? What would be one of your sort of broad takeaways? Remembering that we went into studying the fathers as Protestants. Particularly, we were originally evangelicals, and then I sort of went the Reformed route and then moved up to Lutheranism, and then eventually we both made our way into the Anglican Church. And so we were studying the fathers, let's be honest, to look for more armor.
Well, right. My thesis was in grad school was arming myself against the early Eucharist theology, or the theology of the Catholic Church, basically, as it pertains to the Eucharist. And I was trying to find a church that might have existed that didn't believe what Rome or the Orthodox believe about the
That was your first
That was my first semester.
Okay. So, what would you say your major takeaway was from reading the fathers and studying them in that depth?
Well, so I would say to anybody when I said to the seminarian, that is that the fathers are the friends of no one and the friends of everyone. So we can kind of parse that out and explain that.
And some people, they are better friends than others.
Right. And that's going to be our answer, I think, is that they're better friends to some than others. But to get serious, the one big takeaway for me was, there's this perspective on the fathers, or the quote unquote the early church, from those outside of the Catholic Church, and they'll say, the church went way off when we get to Emperor Constantine. That there was a cataclysmic event that happened when the Roman Empire started to get involved in the church, and that's where you start to see vestments and incense. And
so for our audience, that's going to be early 4th century. We're talking like 311, 312-ish, and then especially it culminates in the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD.
Right. So Constantine makes Christianity legal in 311, 312, and then it becomes kind of the official religion of the state as you get to the later 4th century, 380, with Theodosius. And then you see paganism being kind of blocked out. So the idea is that once the Roman Empire got involved, then all this paganism and superstition and Romanism kind of infiltrated the church and completely changed it. So there's this idea of the early church as being kind of this pure primitiveness that's there. And Newman actually talks about it, John Henry Newman. He makes a distinction between the Protestants and Anglicans who see a primitiveness and they want to recover a primitiveness. But the point that always got me was that he says primitiveness is not a church. Right? So when I studied the fathers, I began to realize that it wasn't so much a Constantinian revolution. It was a Constantinian evolution. That the things of the church in the 4th and 5th century, the seeds were already there in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. And you can point to anything. You can point to the liturgy. Right? The liturgy, we know the liturgy was fast developing in the early centuries. Saint Cyprian of Carthage, you studied North African Christianity, he's already talking about the part of the preface where we lift up our hearts, right? He tells us that the church was already practicing those lines, and then the priest would go into the prayers, the preface of the Eucharist, the Eucharistic canon prayers. So we know that liturgy is already fast developing in the early centuries. Look at monasticism.
Yeah.
Monks going out into the desert, going into monasteries. That was already happening pre-Constantine.
Right, it's happening in the 200s.
Right, it's happening in the 200s. Yeah. Eucharist theology. I studied St. Ignatius of Antioch.
Yeah.
He's already telling us.
So who's Ignatius? I mean,
so Ignatius of Antioch is one of the earliest bishops we have writings from. So he died in 107. 107. Now think about that. The Book of Revelation is written in 95.
Right.
This bishop knew the words of the apostles. They say that Ignatius heard the apostles preaching.
Yeah.
And Ignatius knew many. He was a famous bishop.
Well, yeah, more importantly, Ignatius has a relationship with somebody we mentioned in a previous episode, Polycarp of Smyrna. Yeah. So Polycarp, who is definitely a hearer of John, has a very close relationship with Ignatius. So you can't even really say that Ignatius is some outlier who comes out of nowhere, and then but Polycarp and these boys, those are the guys that knew the apostles. Like, Polycarp and Ignatius are of the same faith. Like, they're writing letters to each other. Like, yeah.
And Saint Ignatius writes in one of his letters that there are those who abstain from the Eucharist because they do not confess that it's the body and blood of the Lord. I mean, that's 107.
Right.
So the point being, there are all these things that people associate with Catholicism or with Orthodoxy later on that were already developing in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries.
Yeah. I think the primitive thing really gets you too, because that's what we were after when we went into Protestantism. We were looking for just get back to the what I'm reading in the Bible, right? What I see in St. Paul, what I'm seeing. I just get back to that church.
And that's a good place to start. I mean, that's a good move.
But that's the move first for that was the Reformation. Like, let's get back to the Bible, really. And in fact, the great cry of the time was ad fontes, back to the fount. Like, let's go back to the source and the origin. The thing is, though, I started to realize reading the Fathers that, while you're reading these debates that are happening, it's just constant debates, and all these sects, Christian sects, right there in the early centuries. It's like you can't live this way. Like, you can't do church this way. It was never meant to be this way. And St. Paul even hints at that in his letter to the Corinthians, where he says, I laid a foundation, which is Jesus Christ. Someone else is building on that foundation, and then others will keep building and building and building. And he says basically that every work that somebody adds, you better be careful how he adds to it, because the day when it comes and the fire burns it, all the wood, hay, and straw that was added is going to be burned out, and everything that was precious will remain. So there's that whole idea of Paul is only this foundation period, and the church is going to grow into something much more complex and beautiful. Right. And we should expect that. I mean, if you're looking at the Old Testament, Israel. Can you imagine if Israel just forego the temple and then go back and no, we need to go back to the primitive Israel.
Right. We need to be in the desert.
Right. We need to go back into the desert and live in tents and wander around for 40 years aimlessly.
That was the pure religion.
Right. No. And this covenant is supposed to be even better than what Israel was, the kingdom of Israel with the temple and all this stuff. So that's the point. Is that I realized that it's really the great church, what they call in history the great church, that eventually blossoms into Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Right. That church did create something that was better than the Old Covenant. It's like the temple that was just in Jerusalem. That temple is now all over the earth. There are temples everywhere to the one true God. And there's only one historic church that did convert the entire world.
Well, so the thing is, when we look back at the Fathers, we don't have to always agree with them.
Right.
Because we're the church. And the church is the final judge of what's right and what's wrong. So we look back at the Fathers and we appreciate the theology they've given us. But I think sometimes in the Protestant world, they'll look back at the Fathers and say, well, I agree with Augustine here, or I agree with Cyprian here, or I agree with, they're picking and choosing a religion where we're just saying, oh, well, it's not so much we have to always agree with the Fathers, it's that we're in communion with the Fathers.
But I would even submit that there's not as much tension.
No.
If you're a Catholic or an Orthodox and you go back and read the Fathers, you're very comfortable with what they're saying. But we as Protestants, I was sweating reading the Fathers, because you're like, oh man, how do I explain this one away? And it's just constant.
Well, didn't the Unity of the Church, the treatise by Saint Cyprian, really strike you?
Oh yeah.
Because you kind of, you were taught in, I guess, Protestant circles that there wasn't a solidified great church, like you said. But you look at something like the treatise that Cyprian writes on the unity of the church, and you're like, man, it really does sound like there is this universal church that he's speaking to, and they're answering back to him.
They have, and these churches across continents, they have a common budget. They acknowledge each other as bishops of the Church of God. They're excommunicating one another. I mean, we're talking as early as the 2nd century. You have the Bishop of Rome excommunicating bishops in Asia Minor. I mean, could you even imagine in, like, let's say an evangelical church structure or something like that? I mean, like, that's not happening. I mean, so you just start to see that this was a very organized Christian movement, and all of its faith and its piety.
There were sects, but there is the great. That's why they term it that. There was the great church.
There was this great church where, well, what are you saying? What was your tradition? What did you receive from the apostles? Okay, we received that too. And there's this constant communication. And what's remarkable about it is that in an age where there is no technology, there is no media, and there literally are just like letters passing around for weeks or months on end.
Thankfully, there was no Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that they were able to stay so unified in the faith. That was what was so surprising to me, is that you have to put yourself back in this time where there is no mass communication. There's just, the Roman roads and letters going around, and they would hold the same faith. Somehow you would find out in what is today France, in Gaul, and these people down here in Egypt were able to talk to each other as if they held the same faith. Yeah. And they, prior to that, didn't even know each other. So how did it stay that way? And because we don't have that whole oral tradition. We don't have things like that, but they had that then. And you can just see, and this was my big takeaway, was the trajectory of the religiosity of the fathers tends towards, and I'm going to use lowercase c Catholic, okay, because I want to include the Orthodox as well. It tends towards Catholic religiosity. And it's as clear as day when you're reading it. That's why constantly with Protestant scholars, they're always saying, well, the fathers are ours too. Because they recognize it too when they're reading it, that really, it belongs to the great tradition. Like these fathers really do more so belong to the great tradition. And the great tradition has the right to look back on them even and determine who is heretical and who wasn't. Yeah. And that's what I mean. So there's never a point that you can pinpoint in Catholicism to say like, oh, that's it.
See, I think that's a big takeaway.
Yeah, that's the moment right there where the church goes off track. Yeah. You can't point to it. Yeah. You cannot point to that moment. And that's why you said like the Constantinian Revolution. That's not a thing. It's not a thing.
It's the tree. It's the seed growing into the tree. Yeah. Like when do you point at it and say, oh, it's not. What is it now? It's a tree. It's just growing into its fullness.
And there's that old sort of popular Catholic apologist argument that I never liked. Even when I became, I still don't really like it that much. But there is a seed of truth to it, and that's to say, you really can't name a name that starts Catholicism. You can't name a name and say, oh, that's where Roman Catholicism starts with that guy. And you can't say it for Orthodoxy either. It's like, but with Protestant, you really can. You can say, well, the Calvinist tradition does start with Calvin, and it bears its name. Like, Lutheranism starts with Luther. The Anglican tradition, most people will locate with King Henry, but really it's Queen Elizabeth. Like, that's where, Queen Elizabeth, that's where you finally see the Church of England becoming something other than what it was.
The Elizabethan settlement.
Exactly.
It settles into itself.
Yeah, and so you can always pinpoint a moment where, like, there it is. But you can't do that with Orthodoxy and Catholicism because it's so organic. And the only time you can even say Orthodox and Catholic, even that's difficult. That's difficult because you can say, oh yeah, 1054, the Great Schism, but you still have the Council of Florence happening after that. I mean, you still, and most people didn't even know they were out of communion. I mean, so it's very messy even when the Great Schism really happens. So, I would just say that coming to the Fathers, you see that the trajectory of the religiosity is lowercase c Catholic and not this sort of 16th century romanticized view of a primitive church.
Sure.
When you look at Calvin's Geneva, it's like, that's not what was going on in the early church. You know what I mean? Like, even Luther, like what Luther was doing, with like the Mass and how he was editing it and stuff, that's not what the early church liturgies looked like, But he would keep saying that he was recovering the primitive church. Cranmer's liturgy, that wasn't a return to the primitive church. I mean, there were some primitive elements that he was recovering, and he did a better job than anybody else, I think. But it's this romanticized 16th century version of it. The other thing, and this is my final point, broad point that I took away from reading the Fathers and studying them, was the heresies of the 16th century, or what we as Catholics would come to see as Protestant heresies, had already been dealt with in like an early form in the early church. it was kind of like, oh my gosh, like this is kind of like a 16th century argument, you know, like Augustine versus Pelagius, you know, like the Pelagian argument of faith versus works. It's like they had this argument, you know, it's like even the argument about what the Eucharist is, like they had this argument, you know, and so if you're somebody who has studied patristics and you come to the 16th century to study the Protestant Reformation, that's what happened to us actually. We came and we took our Reformation, you know, 300 course, and we're sitting there and we were exhausted. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of the students around us who didn't take a patristics course or didn't study the fathers, didn't know any of that, like they were enthralled by like this Reformation story. Wow, like whoa, what a great argument. And we're thinking like these arguments are just ridiculous because these have already happened. Yeah, you know. So
you know, I think the fathers too. They, you know, when I say that they're friends of everyone and friends of no one, what I mean by that is that they balance people out.
Yeah.
That's why Pope Benedict XVI is so very balanced in his theology, because he's a patristic man.
That's right.
Right. So I think that's kind of the takeaway if you're looking for a benefit of the fathers. They're this foundation just above the apostolic foundation that you should look to help you moderate your theology. And I think that's very helpful in today's environment with so many different Christianities out there, right? To go back to the fathers and say, well, what did they say? And then build from there again. And
I think that's really important. Like, you know, this is not to say that you go back and read the fathers and it's like, oh, there it is, the Pope.
Well, you shouldn't proof text them just like you shouldn't proof text the Bible.
Exactly. Like, if you're a Roman Catholic and you're going back and reading the fathers, you're not going to find like, you know, medieval Roman Catholicism in the fathers. You're not going to find it there. You know, even like the single bishop of Rome, like even that's kind of foggy in the first and second centuries. Like, you know, there's a lot of debates about that. So, you know, it's not comfortable for anybody, but that's why I think that's where Newman comes in, you know, the development of doctrine. We'll talk about that in another episode. We don't have to get into that now. But, you know, just to say that nobody's going to be totally comfortable coming to the fathers.
Because you're watching it unfurl.
Right. And I think that's a reason, like you said, why with Pope Benedict, people had such a hard time reading him, but also I think this is another reason why people have such a horrible time interpreting Vatican II. So I think that broadly speaking, that's what happened when two Protestants went into the fathers.
So is the early church Protestant or Catholic? Mm-hmm. It's lowercase Catholic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.